the discipleship that you should take seriously, which we agree with him on that, would have to include these ideas that they're going to encounter as they leave our homes and go to school, and how to think through those. And so if they're false ideas, teaching our kids about those ideas, helping them to see how they're false, and helping them to see the truth.
Well, today we're gonna really kind of be brave and jump into the world of Twitter. And are you ready for this?
You look so
Erin?
serious.
Well, Twitter's a serious place.
Seriously messy place.
A seriously messy place. If you're not on Twitter, good for you. Don't join. Okay. But what we wanted to do today for today's podcast is take a tweet from a pastor, well-known pastor on Twitter, and nothing personal against him. And because we're gonna critique a tweet here. Some of it's gonna be critique. Some of it's gonna be saying, hey, maybe there's some more we need to think about. But
there's certainly some agreement.
Yeah, there's certainly some agreement. So we're trying to be real, politically gentle.
No, we're not.
And we're qualifying everything.
We're trying to be thoughtful.
If word gets back to this pastor that we've criticized him, we just want him to know that we love him. Is that good? Is that good qualification? No, but here's the tweet. And of course we understand Twitter's a very limited medium. So
right.
Of course he would.
You get 149 characters. Is that it?
No, I think it's
140.
No, it's 160.
Oh, you get 160?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's 160 still.
Oh, that's way different than 149. I can see why you laugh.
Well, as a Twitter user, I thought you would have known the exact character count, but you're a rookie. So I want to read the tweet. Now, he starts it off by saying parents, and that's, of course, what this podcast is all about. That's our primary audience is parents. So we thought this is relevant to us, and so why we wanted to kind of take this. It
got our attention because he says parents, so we listen.
Yeah. So parents, if you are concerned your children are being quote unquote indoctrinated in school, I suggest the following. Number 1, take your discipleship seriously. Number 2, embody faithfully the faith you want your children to make their own. Number 3, love them with time. And then number 4, attend church faithfully. And so in one sense, we'd say, hey, that's a good list. In another sense, we'd say, oh, it's woefully inadequate. In some ways. Now, we know, again, I understand it's a tweet, but I want to actually read an email that we received here at Maven from a dad who might say, hey, actually, I did all those things. And what was the result? Well, here's what the dad wrote to us. He said, I'm not a pastor nor in ministry. I'm a 53-year-old dad whose 25-year-old son, my best friend, told me 2 years ago he didn't believe in God anymore. That conversation changed my life. This same kid grew up in a Christian home, Christian school, vibrant church, fantastic youth group, and went on more than 10 impactful mission trips at home and abroad. How could this have happened? We are not immune here in the Bible Belt. So this is a dad who might say, I did. I took my, discipleship seriously, embodied the faith, loved them with time, attended church faithfully, and maybe even more. And that wasn't enough to keep a kid in the faith, keep them from being indoctrinated by the world. So I guess we want to take this and use this as a springboard to talk more about this, to get us as parents to think more carefully about the discipleship of our kids. Yeah. So I think one of the tools that we can use when it comes to stuff like this is questions. And we've talked about these questions before. Of course, we've suggested the book Tactics by our good friend Greg Kokel. Tactics is a book every parent should read to be equipped in the 21st century. But Greg gives us a couple of tactics, a tactic called the Columbo tactic. But there are several questions that he uses in that. And the first question is, what do you mean by that? And it's just a clarification question. And so when you really learning to become a good thinker, as you become a better thinker, you will ask that question more and more, because we look at this and say, actually, that's the first thing that we need to do is say, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So when you hear a claim as a parent, so this pastor's talking to us, parents, and then he makes this claim. If you're concerned about your children being indoctrinated in school.
Pause.
So that's a claim, right? And that's a claim that I think the majority of Christian parents in America have some type of concern about their children in the culture today.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I've met a parent that isn't concerned in some way or another about raising their kids in this culture. And that's part of what we do at Maven is help to equip parents, grandparents, youth pastors, leaders to disciple their kids in this culture and in this time. And so his question of if you're concerned, and then he puts indoctrinated in quotes. So he's, in other words, quoting someone, like,
it could be that he's undermining the whole word indoctrination.
Yeah,
right?
it's hard. It's hard to know, but you do wonder if it's kind of like, hey, if you're concerned about this kind
quote,
of
unquote indoctrination
fairy tale thing of them being indoctrinated, this is what he would suggest. So
now we're not sure what his view is on that,
right?
But that's I think the first question.
Yeah.
What do you mean by indoctrination?
Mm-hmm.
Are you are you saying that's an imaginary thing? Are you saying that's a real concern? Are you saying it's not a concern? Yeah, that's where we'd want to start.
And what do you mean by the word indoctrinated? Like, are you recognizing that when a concerned parent would say that, what they mean is that their kids are being taught things that are the opposite of what the parent is trying to teach their children. So especially from a Christian worldview, Christians would use this in a way of like they're indoctrinating. So they're teaching a worldview that's different than the worldview that we're teaching, and that's a concern.
Yeah. Now, and of course, indoctrination has kind of a negative connotation. And I'm curious. I was just sitting here thinking, I wonder what if I type in right now the word indoctrinate and get a dictionary definition, what would we see? Indoctrination, here it is. It's a noun. The process of teaching a person or group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically, right? So that's the negative connotation part, that you accept these things uncritically.
And of course, children are more susceptible to accepting a set of beliefs uncritically. They, especially young children, have not been taught how to think critically about things. And young children trust adults, especially teachers or, who's ever in authority over them. And so, of course, lots of people are concerned about their kids being indoctrinated or being taught to accept a set of beliefs uncritically.
Yeah, so I think what we want to say is, hey, if you've got concerns about that, those are legitimate. And at the end of the day, we use the word indoctrination, but we don't want our kids to be taught false things, a false view of reality.
Yeah.
Now, again, are there going to be some significant disagreements, and are there going to be reasonable disagreements? Yes. But what we're seeing in the culture are, some of the things that are being taught in a, public school setting are things that go against common sense, that go against the nature of reality. And, just all the gender stuff, right? If a school is teaching kindergartners or first graders, teaching them that men can be women and women can be men, well, that is cause for serious concern. And those concerns are legitimate. And you're not overreacting to the quote unquote indoctrination of the school system. Those are legitimate concerns because you don't want your kids to believe something that's false that then in turn will bring harm into their lives.
Yeah. And it's hard. Again, this is the limit of Twitter and that, and those sorts of things. But we got a window into what he thinks about indoctrination because someone commented on his tweet and then he retweeted it. So you retweet that like, hey, I agree with this.
It's an endorsement.
And so the mom said, I agree with all of this. It rubs me the wrong way when it's suggested to me that my children are being indoctrinated because they attend public school. We take discipleship seriously in our home, and I always pray for them to be a light wherever they go. We don't walk in fear.
Well, there's a number of things we could say there, but
the idea that she gets rubbed the wrong way when it's suggested that her children are being indoctrinated
because they attend public school.
So it by his retweeting it's showing he's agreeing with that, and then she says we don't walk in fear at the end. So that if you were concerned about indoctrination, that doesn't mean you're walking in fear either.
Yeah. And that's why we want to say, hey, these are legitimate concerns.
Right.
Now, I think part of the pushback too on this kind of thinking is that if your children are attending a public school and they're kindergartners or first graders or second graders, you do have to be concerned of them being indoctrinated. And you can't let that rub you the wrong way. That's just what can happen very easily because at that stage of life, their mind of a child is not equipped to think logically and to reason through things and to weigh evidence. And so they just in the teaching, they often accept things on mere authority. Oh, this is my teacher, and what my teacher says is right and true and correct. And they're going to accept that uncritically. That's just kind of the nature of education at those younger ages. And so if that rubs you the wrong way, maybe you need to step back and think about what's going on, what's actually going on. And even if you're doing some serious discipleship in your home, that's great, that's wonderful, that's important. But your kid is in school from, let's say 8 o'clock until 2. 8 to 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2. That's a minimum of 6 hours. 6 hours, 5 days a week. That's 30 hours a week of teaching that's unsupervised by you whatsoever, almost. 30 hours of teaching week in and week out, right? Unfortunately, just by the nature of that arrangement, you are giving authority, and there's a place for this. I'm not saying the enterprise is illegitimate, but you are giving authority to someone else to teach your kid. Mm-hmm. And so that could be a form of indoctrination.
Yeah, it's certainly something that you at least have to think about as a parent, and that's something that we thought about as parents. We've talked about before, we've done public school, we've done private school, and we've done homeschooling. So we have sent our kids to public school. We're not saying this without experience of doing it ourselves. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to be someone who's walking in fear to have concerns or to be aware of what's going on, especially right now in public schools.
Yeah. So don't let these kinds of comments, these kind of statements, make you set aside your concerns. Mm-hmm. No, these kind of concerns are legitimate, and
or feel like they're illegitimate concerns, or that you're being silly for being concerned about it.
You're overreactive, or you're a fearful person, and we're not supposed to live in fear, right? No, there's healthy concern here. Okay, so that whole idea of being indoctrinated by school is something to take seriously. Mm-hmm. And so that's the first. What do you mean by that question? The second one is, okay, so in point number 1, here's his first recommendation. right? Number one, take your discipleship seriously. And we would say, amen, of course,
Yeah.
yes. Now, and again, it's a tweet, so there's a lot more to say. And what we need to ask there is, what do you mean by discipleship? What does discipleship look like? How is it defined? How does this get cashed out? Because, I think there are people who would say, well, we have taken our discipleship seriously, and, well, but what does that look like? Because if you start with either a wrong view of discipleship, a shrunken view of discipleship, an inadequate view of discipleship, well, you can take that view seriously, but you might not have the tools to equip yourself and then to equip your kids. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the discipleship part of our definition or our view of discipleship has to require a discipleship of the mind. And this is where we've seen over the last, maybe 100 years or so, if not longer, an anti-intellectualism in American evangelicalism that has become so pervasive in the church. And so our discipleship, our modern day discipleship and methods of discipleship and books and all of that are so anti-intellectual or so lacking of the intellectual depth that we need for this current cultural moment that even if you took that discipleship seriously, it would still be inadequate. And so, yes, we need to take discipleship seriously, but we need to first cash out, what does it look like to be discipled? And clearly, to be a disciple of Jesus means that we love him with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind, and that's Jesus's great commandment in Matthew 22. We love God with our minds. And so we need to bring the mind into discipleship. And so when it comes to the education of our kids, learning theology, learning worldview, learning apologetics, learning logic, these are all things that should be part of a kid's discipleship and our discipleship, especially if we're going to be adequately equipped to keep our kids from being indoctrinated. I wonder how many parents, and by no fault of their own, but just the lack of kind of the church lacking in this area, just a lot of parents are not equipped to disciple their kids' minds. And so so when we talk about discipleship, we've got to cash that out. And what does that include? And what areas does that cover? Because if it just means like love Jesus and be good kind of thing, which is in one sense a way that you could summarize a lot of Christian teaching on discipleship over the last, 30, 40 years. Well, maybe that's inadequate. And especially when you look at the cultural climate. Like the cultural climate is different now than it was 30 or 40 years ago, when you had a culture that was, I think it could be argued, much more friendly to the Christian worldview. Now you have a culture that I think we could argue is much more hostile and much more aggressively hostile towards the Christian worldview. And it's pervasive, and you add in technology, and it's ubiquitous, and the challenges are all over the place, and our kids are soaking in this. In that climate, our intellectual discipleship of our kids really needs to be serious-minded.
Especially if you are sending your kids day in and day out to a public school, which is more and more changing. You were just talking about the culture. More and more of these ideas of the culture are part of course, the culture of a public school. And so the discipleship that you should take seriously, which we agree with him on that, would have to include these ideas that they're going to encounter as they leave our homes and go to school, and how to think through those. And so if they're false ideas, teaching our kids about those ideas, helping them to see how they're false, and helping them to see the truth, right? And it made me think about when we read this tweet about taking your discipleship seriously. And of course, we agree with that. And we have a much bigger view of discipleship like you just described. But it made me think of our friend Katie Faust's article in the Federalist that she wrote about. Katie Faust has her kids in public school, and she wrote an article saying 4 ways to help your kids fight assimilation into cultural leftism. And it's on the Federalist website. We'll link to it in our show notes. But she goes through really practical things that parents have to do to train themselves and then their kids as they engage in the culture of the school.
Yeah. So if you want a kind of a definition, if we say, okay, take your discipleship seriously. Well, in one sense, okay, we could say amen, but we need to ask, what do you mean by discipleship? Okay, now something like Katie's article is going to help answer that in a much more in-depth kind of way. And one of the first things she says in this article is, you, talking to parents, are the primary educators. Okay, that, to unpack that when it comes to our discipleship and the discipleship of our kids, that starts putting some more meat on the bones there for us. And so when it comes to education, even if your kid is going to the public school, to still have the mindset, I'm the primary educator. I'm the gatekeeper here, especially when they're younger, because I want them to grow in their knowledge. I don't want them to come to affirm false beliefs, false ideas about reality. And so you are the primary educators is her first point. Number 2, she says, include your kids in what you're already doing. And she talks about kind of, just a lot of practical ideas there as well. Third thing she says is balance protection and exposure, which that is very relevant to a parent who has their kid in public school, right? You got to think about protecting them from false ideas and false values and a false view of what's good and a false view of marriage and gender and sexuality. And how much exposure you give and when do you give that. So she's putting more detail to this. And number 4, she says, stay connected, which I think this kind of fits with what he says in 3. And we would agree with this. Love them with time. There is no replacement for a loving, connected relationship with your kid. That's a vital part of this. In fact, that's the proper context, relational context in which to do the discipleship of the mind, right? You need that. And
and that goes for, parents that are married, single parents, that you have to prioritize time with the kids. And that, that's what Katie talks about in the article. And that's what, of course, this pastor, one of his points that we really do agree with, that this does require time together carved out from, and I mean, we've done whole podcasts on pushing things out of your schedule and how important that is in discipleship, not signing up for every activity, not letting sports or activities rule your family's calendar, even more so if they're gone at school all day, even more so if they're gone at a public school all day, that prioritizing time with them there's just no replacement for that.
Yeah. Okay, we did skip over to, he talked about embody faithfully the faith you want your children to make their own. And that's another point we'd say amen. And I think that's an essential part of this, right? It's not just, hey, do what I say, but it's
an essentially difficult part of this.
Yeah. It's let me live this out also, and you watch that. And I think that's part of, what Katie talks about in her point. It was number 2, include your kids in what you're already doing. And so that's an essential part of discipleship, is letting our kids see us engaged in these kinds of things. So for instance, we're at home and, or we're out at the store. In fact, this happened recently at a local Target where we were in the pet section getting some food for our pets, and there was a section and this was for Pride Month, but pet clothing and pet toys that were LGBTQ themed, right? And so there we're at the store and we're able to pause, and I think I was with Ella or it was Ella or Jonah, or maybe it was both of them, and we had a little conversation about that, and I think the point I emphasized with them there was just how pervasive it is. It's all around. In fact, we could go all around that Target. You go in the card section, and there are cards now for 2 dads and 2 moms. And then you can go into the clothing section, and there's pride clothing, and just on and on and on. It's all over. It's so pervasive. And so that's just trying to embody a critical engagement, a thinking carefully with, the world and around, that's all around us. And it just, that's just a small snapshot on how we embody this stuff. But that's absolutely critical. And then fourthly, right, he says attend church faithfully. And we'd say, yeah, but there's got to be more to that as well, because you can attend church faithfully, but what if you're part of a church that holds kind of a different view of discipleship, right? Or what if you're part of a church that is anti-intellectual? What if you're part of a church that isn't equipping you to engage the current ideas of the culture? If you're at a church that has not addressed the issues of love and gender and marriage and sexuality over the last year or so, that church, it doesn't matter how faithful you are to that church, you're not going to be equipped to, and if your kids are at a youth group that doesn't address these kind of things, right? And obviously we as parents are the primary educators, and we've got to address these things. But again, we need to cash this out more, and we need to have churches that are addressing these kinds of things so that we aren't simply indoctrinated by the culture or catechized by the culture.
Well, and he's a pastor, so I know he would mean more than just attend church, because I read that and I think, yes, of course, attending church faithfully is actually something that, we know from studies that a lot of Christians don't even do that. But I would say even more than just attending a church, but that our kids need to be a part of a church community, that they need to have belonging in that church community, that they don't just attend it on a Sunday morning, but that actually the church becomes a place that's home to them, that's their community, that, that these are our people kind of thing. And I'm sure the pastor would agree with that. But just even thinking about something like that, we can't just take for granted that we live in a community that's friendly to going to church. We don't live in a community that's friendly to that. And so even more than just attending church faithfully, we have to even think differently, I think, about that in this time and place and culture, on how important it is for our kids to have really robust community in other places other than just the public school where they attend. So, all of that to say, I think we read it and it almost sounds like, this we don't have to worry about indoctrination if we do these things. And we read that email from that dad that was just so heartbreaking when we got that at Maven. And the discipling of our kids is a huge thing to take seriously, as the pastor said, but it's a much bigger thing than maybe a simple way that some people might look at it.
Yeah, I think this is where we as parents need to define what does the discipleship of our kids look like in the 21st century, given this cultural context. And because frankly, the ways that we've done stuff, and sometimes I look at the church and I think, gosh, the church seems to be doing the same things that we were doing 30 years ago, or we're kind of doing church in the same kind of ways. And we're now in a different cultural context. And there's lots of evidence that what we're doing is not that effective because we're just not the kind of salt and light in the culture that we should be. And we're bleeding kids. I mean, we're bleeding young people out of the church. And, with each successive generation, we're seeing a loss of biblical worldview where it's like Gen Z now, only 4% of Gen Zers, according to the latest Barna research, only 4% affirm a biblical worldview. I mean, 4% in the culture. And less identify as Christians, more identify as having no spirituality, the nuns as they call them. And so we may have to spend some time really thinking carefully about the nature of discipleship and figuring out a plan that's going to be a lot more intentional than even what's said here. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we thought this tweet was a good opportunity to get parents thinking about the serious nature of discipleship. And hey, a lot of parents are concerned about what their kids are being taught. And sometimes the response of the church, especially to the challenges of the culture, can be a little maybe nonchalant. I think that's what we're sensing here with this. And the threats are not being taken as seriously as they should be. And this is coming from, I think, you and I, who have we've got our feet in the culture. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're constantly looking at the culture, reading it, living in it, looking at, on a national level and a local level. And so...
Yeah, and even with our own kids. I mean, we're raising kids right now too. And so we understand the concern of children being indoctrinated because we are raising kids who are hearing all kinds of messages and have believed things that aren't true and have been swept into things. And so we are battling this too.
Now we're hearing more and more from parents, Christian parents, whose kids are buying into the culture's gender ideology. Mm-hmm. And now they're 13-year-olds are saying they're a boy trapped in a girl's body, mm-hmm. and they want to transition. So these are real concerns. They're mm-hmm. legitimate, and we've got a serious challenge ahead of us. And so we have to do a little bit more in terms of thinking carefully about the discipleship of our kids. Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.